by partisan ideology, that we're driven by doing our jobs, listening to the American people. And, Mr. President, it is my fervent hope that over the course of this week, over the course of this debate, that all 46 senators on the Republican side will unite, and that more and more Democrats will come together and say, listen, we have an obligation to our constituents, and that's an obligation we're going to honor.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I'm happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
Ask my distinguished colleague, the senator from Texas, a series of questions with regard to this concept, make D.C. listen. You know, it's interesting that we have this discussion right now at a time in our history when never has it been easier for so many people throughout the country with so few resources to be heard by so many. In the past, you had to own a newspaper, or perhaps in more recent years, you had to own a radio station or a television company or something like that to be heard by a lot of people. But these days, pretty much anyone can gain access to a telephone or to the internet. They can send an email, they can submit a post. It's one of the things that has made possible a groundswell of people. You mentioned just a few minutes ago 1.6 million Americans just in the last few weeks signing a petition asking for Congress to make a decision to protect the American people from the harmful effects of Obamacare. They want government funded, just as we want government funded. They want government to be able to continue to do the things that government does. They want people to be able to rely on government to protect them, to protect our borders, to protect our sovereignty, protect our homeland against those who would harm us. They want government to be able to carry out its basic functions and its responsibilities, and so they want their government funded. But they don't want that held hostage by something else. They don't want that funding tied to the funding with Obamacare, in the sense that they want to keep government funded, but they want us to defund Obamacare. The House of Representatives showed that D.C., at least that side of D.C., that side of the Capitol, was listening. I applaud the Speaker of the House and the other leaders in the House of Representatives who did that. That suggests to me that they were listening on that side of the House. When they had many millions of Americans calling out on the telephone, through mail, email, every conceivable medium for relief from this bill, they listened. They listened because they understand that the American people are being hurt by this. And they asked the same questions that you and I and others have asked. How many more Americans will have to lose their jobs because of Obamacare before Congress acts? How many more Americans will have to see their wages or their hours cut as a result of this ill-conceived law before we do something about this? How many more people will have to lose access to health coverage before Congress does something? You know, just last Friday we saw Home Depot, one of America's great companies, one of America's great success stories, one of America's great employers, announced that 20,000 employees will be losing their health coverage. How many more stories like this will we have to hear before Congress does something to protect Americans from the harmful effects of this law? A law that was passed a few years ago without a single Republican vote in the House of Representatives. A law that was passed just a few years ago without a single Republican vote in the United States Senate. A law that was passed, all 2,700 pages, as it was then constituted, without, as far as I know, many, if any, members of this body or the other body in the Capitol having had the opportunity fully to read it. Since then, of course, it's expanded. We've had an additional 20,000 pages of regulations promulgated, increasing rather exponentially the impact of this law. The popularity of the law has not improved with time, just as the complexity of the law has not become less problematic in the intervening 3.5-year period. And so as we look at this, we think about the fact that it is important for Congress to listen to the American people. And again, today, it has never been so easy for so many Americans with so few resources at their disposal to make sure that they are, in fact, heard. So we have to ask ourselves the question, and I have to ask you the question, how long will it be before Congress acts? I'm pleased, Senator Cruz, that you referred to the opportunity crisis, the economic opportunity crisis in America, and you referred to the economic ladder in this country. You know, I think it's an interesting fact that we need to consider that according to one recent study published, I believe, just in the last few weeks, that for the first time in American history, 40% of those born in America into the bottom quintile of the American economy, the bottom 20% of income earners in this country, 40% of the bottom 20% will remain in the bottom 20% throughout the duration of their lifetimes. To my knowledge, that has never happened in this country. To my knowledge, this undercuts what has long been a very distinguishing, enviable characteristic of the United States. It's what has made this the greatest civilization the world has ever known. It's the fact that this is a country where, regardless of where you were born on that economic ladder, regardless of the circumstances in which you came into this world or came into this country, you could make it. And in fact, your chances of doing so were relatively strong. Yet 40% of those people, we now understand, will stay there throughout the duration of their lives. Another study came out, also a few weeks ago, indicating that in 34 states in the District of Columbia, an individual or a family is actually likely to see a dip in their well-being, a dip in their standard of living, if instead of receiving welfare benefits, they decide instead to shed those benefits and go on to an entry-level job. That's sad. That's sad because that suggests that our government, as well-intentioned as many of those programs might be, may well have set in place a series of conditions that trap people, especially parents, into a vulnerable, poor condition. If there's one thing that parents, I think, you feel somewhat universally, it's a degree of risk aversion. People don't like to take risk that could jeopardize their ability to provide for their children. If we set up a set of conditions in which people, in order to maintain their level of certainty that they might have while surviving under a system of welfare benefits provided by the federal government, if they become locked into that, locked into poverty in perpetuity because of that, that's disconcerting. Because if the risk is always too high to make that jump onto an entry-level job, without the entry-level job, there will never be the secondary job. There will never be the first raise or the second raise, the first or second or third or fourth promotion. Without those things, there is no ladder. Without those things, there is an opportunity lock in which people remain on the bottom, in the bottom rungs of that very ladder. We see at the top rungs a system of crony capitalism that sometimes has the impact of keeping some people, some big businesses, artificially held in place at the top of the economic ladder at the expense of others, at the expense of would-be competitors who are driven out or held out from the beginning from the competitive marketplace through the oppressive intervention of the government, through the government's favoritism, and through the government's ability sometimes, regrettably, to choose winners and losers in the marketplace. Then you see where most Americans are, right in the middle of the ladder. In the middle rungs, you see people working, trying to get by from day to day. They're able to survive. They're able to provide for the basic needs of their families. But they'd like to do better. They'd like to be able to provide a more comfortable living for their family. And they find very often that no sooner do they find an increase in their income, and that same increase has been gobbled up by a combination of oppressive taxes, oppressive regulations, and the devastating impact of inflation. When those things happen, we find that people are unable to make their way up that economic ladder. So we find ourselves at a precipice of sorts. We find ourselves about to embark on a very bold experiment in which we rather dramatically expand the role of the federal government, injecting it more directly, more completely, more dangerously into one of the most personal aspects of most people's lives, into the healthcare industry, an industry that comprises a very significant portion of our nation's economy, in an area in which people feel strongly about their own right, about their own innate, inherent need and desire to maintain a degree of control that is not subject to the will and whim of government bureaucrats in Washington. And at the same time that the government is doing that, the government will be consuming an increasingly large share of the resources moving through our economy, making it even harder for people who are trying to get by to do so, and to do so without undue interference from the government. This is an issue that's important to so many people. This is an issue that reminds people of the fact that whenever government acts, it does so at the expense of our own individual liberty. It does so at the expense of our ability to live our lives as we would live them. It does so very often at the expense of the American economy. It does so very often at the expense of economic opportunity for Americans. You see, because when we expand government, we expand its cost. We make ourselves, as a country, less free. We leave ourselves with fewer alternatives. Is there a role for government to play in health care? Absolutely. Of course there is. No one disputes that. Are there improvements that can be made to our health care system? Certainly there are. But a 2,700-page law that was passed after members of Congress were told they had to pass it in order to find out what's in it, that has expanded since then to include within its penumbra 20,000 pages of regulatory text. A law that has become less and less popular as time has gone on. This has become very, very difficult. And we find that this becomes less and less of something that the American people support. So I would ask you, Senator Cruz, do you feel like the American people have every right to speak out on this? And specifically, do you feel like the American people have every right to expect that those of us serving in the United States Senate will do everything that we possibly can, even casting difficult votes, even casting procedural votes that might be difficult to cast or difficult to explain? Do they have every right to do that, even if it causes great inconvenience for them and for us in the process of complying with their wishes?
Well, I thank my friend from Utah for that very good question, and the answer is absolutely yes. That's the foundation of our nation. You know, if you look at the history of government in the world, it hadn't been pretty. The history of government for most of the existence of mankind has been a story of oppression, a story of rulers imposing their will on their subjects. For millennia, we were told that rights come from government. They come from kings and queens, and they are to be given to the people by grace, to be taken away by the whim of the ruler. That has been the state of affairs for most of the history of humanity. And you know, the founding of our nation embodied many revolutions. The first revolution was a revolution that was a bloody revolution fought with guns and bayonets. But even more important than that revolution was the revolution of ideas that occurred. And the revolution of ideas that began this nation was twofold. First of all, America began from the presupposition that our rights come from God. It's for that reason the Declaration of Independence begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed not by a king, not by a queen, not even by a president, but endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That is and was a revolutionary idea. And it led to the second revolutionary aspect of the founding of our nation, was that we inverted the concept of sovereignty. For millennia, sovereignty began at the top. It was the ruler who was called the sovereign. I mean, the word sovereignty derives from that notion. Of course, the sovereign is where sovereignty resides. The American framers turned that notion on its head. We said, there is no sovereign. Sovereignty resides with we the people. That's why our Constitution begins, "We the people," because this nation wasn't founded by rulers, it wasn't founded by elected officials, it wasn't even founded by states. It was founded by we the people, the American people. That is the only place sovereignty has ever resided in the United States of America. And the Constitution, in turn, was created to lend power to government. Not to give it, to lend it, and to lend it, I would suggest, only in good behavior. Thomas Jefferson referred to the Constitution as chains that bind the mischief of government. That sovereignty is an idea we need to get back to. Because, Mr. President, I'm going to suggest that for some time now the United States Senate has not behaved as if we the people are sovereign. For some time the United States Senate has not behaved as if each of us collectively has 3 million bosses. For a long time the United States Senate has behaved as if the rules that matter are the rules that are here in Washington, D.C. That is why, Mr. President, that the most important objective of this week is to make D.C. listen. The most important objective of this week is to reassert that sovereignty is with we the people, that calls from our constituents, that town halls are not a pesky annoyance. It is the core of our job. It is the core of our job to listen to the sovereign, which is we the people. And right now, we the people are hurting. You get outside Washington, D.C., you ask them about Obamacare over and over and over again. The answer you get is this thing isn't working. You know, Mr. President, a few weeks ago, I hosted a small business roundtable in Kerrville, Texas. Kerrville is a delightful town in central Texas. It's in the beautiful hill country. Anyone who wants to come to Texas, I would encourage you. Kerrville is a great destination in Texas. And this was a small gathering in a restaurant, about 20 small business owners. And I asked each of them, I said, let's go around the room. And if each of you could introduce yourself, share a little bit about yourself, and then share a concern that's weighing on your heart. Share something you're praying about, share something you're worried about, share something that you are focused on right now. Now, Mr. President, it was a totally open-ended question. They could have talked about any issue under the sun. They could have talked about Syria. They could have talked about guns. They could have talked about anything. So we went around the table, one after the other, over half of the small business owners around that table said to me, Ted, the single biggest obstacle I face in my business is Obamacare. Hands down, not even close. There's nothing that comes close. You know, it was striking, of those 20, there were probably 4 or 5 of them that relayed some version of this same story. One of them was the fellow who owned the restaurant we were meeting in, and he said, you know, we've got a great opportunity to expand our business. I have an opportunity to make the restaurant even bigger, expand it, and from a business perspective, this opportunity looks really good. But he said, you know, we've got between 30 and 40 employees. If we expand the business, we'll go over 50. And if we go over 50, we're subject to Obamacare. And if that happens, I'll go out of business. So you know what? I'm not pursuing the expansion. We're not going to do it. We're going to stay the size we are. And one person after another around the table said the same thing. Said they had 30 employees, 35, 40 employees. They had great opportunities to go open another location, expand into a new aspect, and one after the other says, we will not do it because if we get over 50 employees, Obamacare will bankrupt us. Now, I want you to think about each of those 4 or 5 businesses and the 10 or 20 jobs that each of them didn't create, isn't creating right now because of Obamacare. And then I want you to multiply that by thousands or tens of thousands of small businesses all across this country that could be creating jobs. And I want you to think about all the people right now that are home wanting to work. And you know, there's some, by the way, I will note, some politicians suggest that some people in this country are lazy, don't want to work. You know what? I don't really believe that. I think Americans want to work. Americans want the self-respect that comes from going to the office, from working, from providing for your family, from working to achieve the American dream. Now, do some people give up? Sure. Can you give in to hopelessness? Yes. When you keep banging your head against a wall over and over and over again trying to get a job and you don't get anywhere, it's only natural for people to feel despair. But I want you to think of the millions of jobs that we could have but for small businesses who are not growing, not expanding, not creating those jobs. You know, another small business owner around that table, Mr. President, owned several fast food restaurants. Now, she had a problem. She owned enough fast food restaurants that she had over 50 employees. And I'll mention that the restaurant business and the fast food business side of it in particular is quite labor dependent. And I doubt there's a sector of this economy that has forcibly reduced the hours of every one of her employees to 29 hours a week. And I'll tell you, Mr. President, this woman, she almost began to tear up. I mean, she was emotional, and she was not happy about this, to put it mildly. She said, listen, we've been in business a long time. Many of these employees we've known 10 or 20 years. These are single moms. These are people, look, if you're working at a fast food restaurant, you're not at the pinnacle of your career. You are struggling to pay the bills. And she said, these are single moms who are working really hard. And they can't feed their kids on 29 hours a week. But she said, you know, they can't feed their kids if I go out of business either. And if we're subject to Obamacare, we go out of business. Now, why 29 hours a week? Well, Mr. President, just like the 50-employee threshold, Obamacare kicks in, it counts as an employee if he or she works 30 hours a week. So one of the things it is forcing small businesses all over the country to do is to force their employees out of good full-time jobs into 29 hours a week because they don't get hammered with the costs and burdens of Obamacare. Mr. President, I'll mention another small business owner that I think will particularly hit home with you because I know the issues that resonate with you. It's an individual who manufactures hunting blinds. Actually, very interesting. They're hunting blinds that are camouflaged to look like trees. They're really very clever creations. And he described how he has been forced to move his manufacturing overseas, to move it to China. So right now he's manufacturing in China, and he said, listen, I want to manufacture here in the United States. That matters to me. I care about that. He said, listen, this would be 150 to 200 good manufacturing jobs here in the United States. Now, Mr. President, you and I both come from states where there are a lot of people in our states who are struggling, who would love to see 200 more manufacturing jobs. You know, manufacturing used to be a tremendous strength of our economy, and the manufacturing sector has been so hammered in recent decades. And yet what this small business owner said is because of Obamacare, if I brought that manufacturing back to the United States, those workers would all be subject to Obamacare, and I can't be competitive in the business. It will drive me out of business. Now, Mr. President, I would ask you to take each of those small business owners and multiply it by the millions of small business owners across this country. The millions of small business owners who aren't growing, the millions of small business owners who are forcing their employees, forcibly reducing their hours to 29 hours a week, the millions of small business owners who are considering moving operations overseas or have already because of Obamacare. Why is the economy gasping for breath? Why are people not able to get jobs? Because Obamacare is killing jobs. And the Senate should listen to the people. We need to make D.C. listen.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I'm happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
Thank you. And would the gentleman acknowledge, does he understand, as I do, that as this monstrosity goes into effect October 1st, as it has all of these really devastating impacts on individuals, small businesses, as that happens, under a special illegal rule from the Obama administration, Congress in Washington get an exemption. They get a special pass. They get a special deal that no other American gets under the law.
I thank the Senator for his question, and he is absolutely right. There are many scandalous aspects of Obamacare. How it was passed on a brutal partisan vote, rammed through with late-night deals that have earned rather infamous nicknames, such as the Cornhusker kickback, that have sadly become part of modern political lore, and the Louisiana Purchase, with all respect to my friend from the great state of Louisiana, who was not involved in that. And one of the most sorry aspects of Obamacare is the aspect that the good Senator Vitter refers to, is the aspect that President Obama has chosen at the behest of Majority Leader Harry Reid, at the behest of Democratic members of the Senate, to exempt members of Congress and their staff from the plain language of the statute. Now, when Obamacare was being passed, Senator Chuck Grassley, a towering giant in this body, a strong, principled conservative, introduced a common-sense provision to Obamacare that said, listen, if you're going to force Obamacare on the American people, if you're going to create these health insurance exchanges and you're going to force millions of people onto these exchanges, then Congress shouldn't operate by better rules than the American people. And so he introduced a very simple amendment that was designed to say, let's treat members of Congress just like the American people so that we don't have this two-class system. And at the time, it's been reported, I was not serving in this body at the time, but it's been reported that that was voted on and accepted because Democratic senators believed the bill would go to conference, and in the conference committee they could strip it out and it would magically disappear. But then, because of the procedural games that it took to pass it, they didn't have the opportunity to do that, and suddenly, horror of all horrors, this bill saying Congress should be bound by the same rule as the American people became the law of the land. And so what happened? Majority Leader Harry Reid and Democratic senators had a closed-door meeting with the President here at the Capitol, where they said, according to the public news reports, let us out of Obamacare. We don't want to be on these exchanges. One would assume they're reading the same news reports the rest of us are reading, that Obamacare is a train wreck, that it's not working. And the last thing members of Congress wanted to do is have their health care jeopardized. And the President directed his administration to exempt members of Congress and their staff, ignoring the language of the statute, disregarding the language of the statute, but just saying, you guys are friends of the administration, we're taking care of you. And I want to take a minute in response to this question to commend the senator from Louisiana. Senator Vitter introduced an amendment to reverse this exemption. And it was a bold amendment. It was an amendment that said, look, we as members of Congress should be subject to the same rules as the American people. We shouldn't be treated by different special rules for us. And indeed, Senator Vitter's amendment said members of Congress should be subject to Obamacare, our staff should be subject to Obamacare, and members of the administration, the political appointees of the Obama administration, who, by the way, are not on the exchanges, they should be too. So if the President and his cabinet appointees and his political officials want to go into your communities and tell you how wonderful Obamacare is, let them do so from personal experience. Let them do so not being exempted. Let them do so subject to, on the same exchanges, subject to the rules the American people are. And the reason I want to commend the senator from Louisiana is his introducing that amendment prompted a response that, Mr. President, I'm going to suggest brought disgrace and disrepute on this body. It prompted a political response that targeted the senator from Louisiana personally. Now, we all know that the old saying that politics ain't beanbag. But the nastiness with which the Democratic majority responded to Senator Vitter for daring to say that the Washington ruling class should be subject to the same rules as the rest of us was extraordinary for Washington, D.C. And in fact, I would note that the majority leader, the junior senator from California, as I understand from public news reports, proposed a response to the Vitter amendment that said any senator who votes for the Vitter amendment, regardless of if it passes, if you simply cast a vote in favor of it, he or she will lose their health insurance. Now, I have to admit, when I first heard of this proposed amendment, I shook my head in amazement. I had never heard of such a thing, and I suggested to a friend who's a law professor, I said, you know, that would make a marvelous law school final exam, to imagine that this amendment is passed into law, and to ask your law students to catalog all of the myriad ways in which such a proposal would be unconstitutional, because you know, I would note, Mr. President, in fact, I've made this point to the law professor I was talking to. I said, if you as a private citizen came to any member of the Senate and said, Senator, if you vote the way I want you to, I'm going to pay you thousands of dollars that you can deposit in your personal bank account. You, Mr. Law Professor, Mr. Private Citizen, would promptly and quite rightly be prosecuted for bribery. It's a criminal offense. It's a felony. If, on the other hand, you or any other member, any other American citizen went to a U.S. senator, went to Senator Vitter and said, Senator Vitter, if you don't vote the way I want, I'm going to take thousands of dollars out of your personal bank account. I'm going to extract them forcibly from your personal bank account. Well, Mr. President, as I told the law professor, then you would be guilty of extortion. And you would be charged and no doubt criminally convicted, because under the black letter definition, that conduct, threatening to pay someone individually thousands of dollars or take thousands of dollars away from them as a direct quid pro quo for how a member of Congress votes, constitutes either bribery or extortion. Now, let me be clear. No member of this body is guilty of bribery or extortion. Why? Well, the simplest reason is the Constitution's speech and debate clause protects all of us, such that given that their action was proposing an amendment themselves, there's a constitutional immunity such that I am not suggesting that anyone is guilty of bribery or extortion, but I am saying that the content of their amendment, if any private citizen who didn't happen to be a member of the Senate did the exact same thing, he or she would have committed a felony under the plain text of those definitions. And so I want to commend Senator Vitter for shining a light on basic fairness, for enduring the vilification that was unfairly directed his way, and for making the point that I'll tell you outside of Washington is simple common sense. I will suggest to you, Mr. President, that if any one of us gets a gathering of our constituents together, I would suggest to you if we get a gathering of constituents from the opposing party and you ask any town hall in your state, do you believe members of Congress should be exempted from Obamacare? We should have a special rule. We should disregard the language of the statute and not be subject to Obamacare like the American people are? The answer would be overwhelmingly no, and it doesn't matter where in the country you are, it doesn't matter what party you are. And so I thank Senator Vitter for having the courage and principle to highlight this particularly unfortunate aspect of Obamacare.
Will the gentleman yield for a further question?
Happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
Will the gentleman also acknowledge that given that history on this issue, given that illegal rule to exempt Congress, to have a special bailout, a special subsidy for Congress that the Obama administration is putting into law without valid authority, that given that we're debating and acting on a spending bill this week, we should be voting on that. We should get a vote on my amendment, your amendment together to block that illegal rule this week. Also, given that the majority leader said he had no problem with a vote on that in theory, said that last week, that he should allow a vote on this crucial amendment, which will be filed to the bill, which will even be a germane amendment on the spending bill this week before this illegal congressional exemption rule goes into effect. Would the gentleman agree?
I agree enthusiastically, and Senator Vitter highlights one of the many reasons why every Republican in this body should vote against cloture on the bill on Friday or Saturday, and why I believe a great many Democrats should vote against cloture as well. Because as we understand it, we are told the amendment process on this bill is going to be rigged. That the amendment process in this bill is going to be that once debate is cut off, there'll be a bill simply to fund Obamacare in its entirety, to delete the House language, and that other amendments will not be allowed, that Senator Vitter's amendment will not be allowed, that an amendment repealing the medical device taxes will not be allowed, that amendments getting the IRS out of the business of Obamacare will not be allowed, that instead it will be a rigged playing field. And the only way to prevent that rigged playing field is for senators to stand together and vote no on cutting off debate on Friday or Saturday when we have that vote. If we stand together and vote no, that forces this body to deal with the problem. Otherwise, we know how the kabuki dance ends. If cloture is invoked, if debate is cut off on the bill, very shortly thereafter, the majority leader has publicly announced he'll introduce an amendment to fully fund Obamacare. That'll be just 51 votes, so every Republican will get to vote no. Every Republican will get to tell his or her constituents they voted no, and yet magically, wonderfully, it will pass because it will be a straight party line partisan vote. And other senators will be silenced. I think Senator Vitter is absolutely correct. We should vote on the Vitter amendment. Indeed, I would like to see the Vitter amendment broader. Another senator, another member of our conference has indicated that if the Vitter amendment were brought up, he would offer an amendment to it to expand it to all federal employees. I think that's a terrific rule. Right now, federal employees earn substantially more than the private sector does. I don't think there's any entitlement to take our tax dollars and to live in a privileged condition being a federal employee. And listen, if members of this body are going to go on television and tell the American people Obamacare is great, it's really good, it's terrific, it's so great, well, then they should be eager to live under it. You can't have it both ways. Either Obamacare is a train wreck, in which case we ought to listen to the American people and fix it, or Obamacare is wonderful and terrific and fantastic and all of the great adjectives that proponents of the bill have used, in which case members of Congress and staff members And federal employees should all eagerly embrace it. And so I very much agree with Senator Vitter that it is critical that we vote on the Vitter Amendment, and it's critical we make clear to the American people that there are not two sets of rules. There's not a ruling class in Washington that somehow gets treated differently. Now, let me talk for a moment about congressional staff members. Because, you know, behind closed door, this issue generates a lot of passion. And, look, there are a great many congressional staff members who are dedicated public servants, who have taken often substantial salary cuts to come to Washington to serve this country, to work brutal hours. And I'll tell you that among congressional staff, just like among members, the Vitter Amendment, the idea that they would be subject to Obamacare, deeply, deeply concerns them. It concerns them on the money side, and it concerns them on the quality of care that they will be able to get and the quality of health insurance that they will be able to get on the exchanges. And to make it real, I will simply note that there are multiple members of my staff who have had very, very serious, even life-threatening health issues, for whom the limited health insurance, the subpar, the poor quality health insurance that many fear will be available on the exchanges, that's not a passing concern. It's not an academic concern. It's not a concern that's sort of, let's put in a talking point. It is very real for a great many congressional staff, including staff in my office. And you know what? If the Vitter Amendment passes, if Congress is subject to the same rules as the American people, there may well be quite a few congressional staff that tender their letters of resignation, that leave. I have had one staff member already indicate she was retiring after many years' service, and the possibility of being put on Obamacare was a real factor in that decision. Now, if we lose some good talent for Congress, that will be a shame and a hardship for every office. But you know what, Mr. President? What does that say? What does it say if Obamacare is such a disaster that congressional staffers, and mind you, a lot of these congressional staffers who may tender their letters of resignation are staffers working for Democratic senators who drafted Obamacare, who fight for Obamacare every day. What does it say that staffers would be willing to quit because the quality of health care under Obamacare would be so poor that they'd rather go somewhere else rather than be subject to those laws? I think that speaks volumes. And the lesson, listen, Senator Vitter, neither Senator Vitter nor I have any interest in the long term in seeing congressional staff and seeing federal employees on Obamacare. But it does have a value of highlighting how bad it is. If this body is content to leave the American people stuck on Obamacare, then you better believe we ought to be subject to the same rules. And if we're not willing to live under those rules, if we say, wow, Obamacare scares the heck out of us and we don't want to be subject to it, then the proper answer is not to vilify the senator from Louisiana or any other senator in this body. The proper answer is to step in and save the American people. In fact, let me suggest something, Mr. President, that would have a powerful clarifying and impact on this body. If only senators would behave as if their constituents were at least as important as their congressional staff. If only senators were to behave as if their constituents were at least as important as they are. To be honest, our constituents are more important. Our constituents are our boss. They're the ones, they're the reason we are fighting. And the fact that this body is so torn apart by the notion that each of us would be subject to Obamacare, subject to the same rules the American people are, it just highlights how broken Washington is. That shouldn't be controversial. That should be obvious. And let me suggest to every member of Congress, to every staffer who is dismayed, and to be honest, Mr. President, saying they are dismayed is an understatement to describe the degree of deep, deep concern and even panic about this. Let me suggest to every member of Congress and every staffer who is feeling that panic, direct that panic not to our own skins. Direct that panic to the American people. Direct that panic to the single mom working at the diner, working 2 29-hour-a-week jobs, who's facing the consequences of Obamacare. Under Obamacare, this administration, this president is getting ready to force millions of people onto exchanges, where they are very likely to lose their health insurance. Now, in the privileged corridors of Washington, the risk of losing your health insurance, boy, that gets people worried. And it should. But it should worry us even more, all the people across this country. And you know what? The majority leader, members of Congress, can get a sit-down with the President of the United States. You know, I'll be honest, 26 million Texans, most Texans can't get a sit-down with the President of the United States. If you're powerful, you can get a special exemption. So we've seen the President, he started out by exempting every big corporation in America. Giant corporations. For a year, he just said, no, doesn't apply to you guys. Now, the language of the law explicitly applies. There's no year delay on the language of the law. And for over 200 years, we have operated as a nation of laws, not men. We have operated as a nation that says, if that's what the law says, then it kicks in January 1 and not a year from now. And yet, what did the President say? No. Big companies have come to us, and my friends in big business, I'm going to give you a year-long exemption. Let me note, Mr. President, if Obamacare were so terrific, why would the President be wanting to delay it until after the next election? You know, that year delay, the timing is not entirely coincidental. The employer mandate was supposed to kick in January 1 of next year, and the President unilaterally and contrary to law delayed it one whole year until after the November 2014 elections. Mr. President, if the representations that so many members of this body make to the American people were true, that Obamacare is terrific, is wonderful, then I would think the President would be eager to have it kick in before the election. If it were a good thing, you would want the good stuff to happen before the election and not after the election. And the fact that it was moved for big businesses is an indication of just how badly this law is failing. But it's not just big businesses that have got an exemption. Members of Congress, senators. Senators can get a closed-door meeting with the President of the United States. And with much fanfare, the President came to the Capitol, met with the Democratic caucus, and as what was widely reported, they asked for a special exemption, and they got one. Now, how about the American people? They can't go in. Look, one of the reasons people are so unhappy with Washington is they get a sense that there are special rules that apply. Wall Street gets special exemptions. The big banks get special exemptions. Dodd-Frank sets up rules that hammer small banks, hammer community banks, hammer the little guys. But what happens to the big guys? They keep getting bigger. Why? Because they get rules made in Washington that favor the big guy over the little guy. And you wonder why there's such dissatisfaction in this country. When you see those rules, if you got political friends in this administration, you too can get an exemption. Now, we saw with much fanfare that just recently the labor unions have more and more been expressing their dismay about Obamacare as they've realized in practice the thing isn't working. Just recently, the labor unions came to the Obama administration and said, hey, we want an exemption too. Big business has got an exemption. Members of Congress have gotten an exemption. Shouldn't union bosses get an exemption? And with much fanfare, the administration reportedly told them no. Mr. President, I'm going to make a prediction right here and now. If the United States Congress does not act, if we don't show leadership in defunding Obamacare, if we don't stand together in imposing cloture on Friday, if we don't act to avert this train wreck for the American people, before the end of this president's term, we are going to see him grant an exemption for labor unions. That's been the pattern. Friends, political buddies, they get a slap on the back, they get a special treatment. So it wouldn't have been great politics to grant the labor unions an exemption right now. Right in the middle of this debate, right when you've got over 1.6 million people signing a national petition, right when Congress is debating it, gosh, it would have looked really bad to grant an exemption then. It's a little reminiscent of the President's remarks concerning Mr. Putin that were caught on tape before the last election, which is, tell Vladimir I'll be able to, I forget the exact language, but work with him a lot more after the election. I don't think it takes any stretch of the imagination at all to understand that give it a little time and let the pesky people that are sort of worked up a little bit on Obamacare, let them dissipate, and then we'll quietly do the exemption for labor unions. And let me note, by the way, the point quietly. One of the self-described, quote, fact-checkers, and there's a whole, well, we may talk long enough that I may talk a little bit about fact-checkers, because that's a particularly pernicious bit of yellow journalism that has cropped up that lets journalists be editorial writers and pretend they're talking about objective facts and basically conclude as a factual matter, not as a matter of opinion, that anyone who disagrees with them is objectively lying. But one point that one of the so-called fact-checkers in the Washington Post took issue with was an observation I've made that President Obama is quietly granting exceptions. I will note that the exception for big business was announced in a blog posting by a mid-level political appointee in the Treasury Department, if I remember right, on a Friday. I may be wrong on the date. I think it was on a Friday. In Washington language, by any measure, when you announce a major policy that impacts the whole country, that exempts giant businesses from your rule that you're jamming on the American people, and you don't do it from the White House, you don't do it from the President, you don't do it as an announcement, you don't take questions on it, you simply put a blog posting from a mid-level staffer. That counts as quietly. Now, it hadn't been quiet since then because everyone happened to notice. And so my prediction right now, Mr. President, is if we get past this, if the forces in this body who defend the status quo, and wow, are there a lot of forces that defend the status quo? There's a lot of people with vested interest in maintaining the status quo. If they prevail, if Obamacare goes into effect before the end of this president's administration, mark my words, you will see an exemption for labor union just like the exemption for big business, just like the exemption for members of Congress. So what are we left with then? We're left with a system where Obamacare is a rule for, as Leona Helmsley famously described them, the little people. For everybody that doesn't have power and juice and connections in Washington, for everybody. Now look, to the men and women at home, maybe you have an army of lobbyists working for you. Maybe you have senators' cell phones on your speed dial. Maybe you can walk the corridors of power. And in that case, you too can get an exemption. But if you're just a hard-working American, if you're just trying to provide for your family, If you're just trying to do an honest day's work, make your community better, raise your kids, set a good example, then the message this President has sent, and sadly the message the Senate has sent, is you don't count. We're going to treat everybody else better than you. Mr. President, that is exactly backwards. It is the hardworking American that we work for, not the lobbyists with tassels on their loafers that wander the halls, but the single mom in a diner. And they're the people who are losing. Now, Mr. President, I want to talk about the harm to jobs and economic growth that's coming from Obamacare. Americans continue to suffer from high unemployment and severe underemployment. Instead of helping job growth, Obamacare's mandates and costs are causing businesses to stop hiring workers, to cut employees' hours, and they're increasing the cost to operate businesses. Small businesses in particular are being hammered by Obamacare. Here are some recent statistics on unemployment and underemployment. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics report for August of 2013, there are 11.3 million unemployed persons. The unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate, is listed at 7.3%. And yet college graduates over 25 face just a 3.5% unemployment. You know, former Democratic vice presidential nominee John Edwards used to talk about two Americas. I didn't agree with a lot of things John Edwards said as a political candidate, but I actually agreed with that notion, and it's a tragic notion that there are two Americas. There are two Americas, A, between the ruling class in Washington and everyone else. But there are also two Americas right now between those of wealth and privilege and power and everybody else. If you're lucky enough to be a college graduate, your unemployment rate is 3.5%. It's pretty good. The people who are getting hammered, who are losing under Obamacare, are the most vulnerable among us. They're young people, they're Hispanics, they're African Americans, they're single moms. For black teens, the unemployment rate is over 10 times higher than it is for college graduates, 38.2%. Mr. President, let me ask you, when small businesses aren't hiring, when small businesses are laying people off, when small businesses are forcing employees to work 29 hours a week, who do you think that's impacting? It doesn't impact titans of industry. The rich and powerful are not losing their jobs. They're not finding themselves forced into part-time work. We talked about the fast food restaurants, the fast food business. Fast food business, that industry is being hammered, and you want to talk about what a tremendous avenue for employment. And in particular for the first or second job someone has, that the fast food industry has been. When you look at an unemployment rate among African American teens of 38.2%, the fast food industry has been such a great avenue for advancement for minority teenagers. And Mr. President, I would note that I don't view that from the perspective of abstract numbers on a piece of paper. I view that from a very personal perspective. Because 55 years ago, when my father came from Cuba, he was 18, he was penniless, and he couldn't speak English. But he was lucky. He was lucky for a couple of things. One, he was lucky to get to America. He was lucky to be able to apply for a student visa, to be accepted, to come in, to be accepted at the University of Texas and be able to come to a land of freedom, to flee oppression, to flee the Batista regime where he had been imprisoned and tortured as a kid. By the time he was a teenager, my father had endured more than the vast majority of members of Congress will ever experience. I will note with that background, it does make the back and forth of Washington pretty mild by comparison. You know, if someone says something mean about you in the newspaper, it may not be altogether pleasant, but it's pretty darn mild compared to being beaten and almost killed in a Cuban jail like my dad was 55 years ago. But when he landed in Austin, if I would ask you, Mr. President, to put yourself in his shoes. Not literally, because I think your feet are bigger than his, but figuratively. When my dad landed in Austin, he couldn't speak English. He didn't know anybody. Imagine being in a strange land where you can't speak English. You got $100 sewn into you as underwear, which my grandmother put there. And the first thing he needed was a job. So I went to look for a job. Problem is, if you're an 18-year-old kid from Cuba and you can't speak English, there are not a lot of jobs you can get. If you can't speak English, it's pretty hard to get a job where you've got to deal with customers who are going to expect you to speak English. And at that point, he didn't have a lot of skills. He was a teenager. So his first job was washing dishes. He made 50 cents an hour. Why did he get that job? Because you didn't have to speak English. Even though he didn't have a lot of skills, as an 18-year-old kid, he was perfectly capable of taking a dish, sticking it under really hot water, scrubbing it, and setting it aside. And he did that over and over and over again. Now, I'll tell you something. When my father was here, I mean, he had no means of support other than washing dishes. So what he did, one of the reasons he wanted to work in a restaurant is that restaurants would let you eat while you were working. It was one of the perks of working at a restaurant is the employees were able to work. And my father had no money for food. He barely had money to pay for a tiny little apartment and I think he actually started in the dorms, I believe, and tuition. That was it. So he didn't have money to buy food, so what my dad did is he ate at work. And since he liked to eat 7 days a week, he worked 7 days a week. And he'd go in, and he only ate during those 8 hours. During the 8 hours he was working, wash your dishes, he would eat like crazy. I mean, he'd just feed his face. Because when he left the office, the next 16 hours, he wasn't eating anything. He wasn't buying food. He wasn't doing anything until the next 8 hours he showed up at work. That was the next time he was going to eat. Now, some people may look at a dishwashing job, paying 50 cents an hour, and turn their nose up at it. Say, well, who really cares about people in jobs like that? Sometimes this Senate behaves like that. Who really cares about people in jobs like that? But, you know, after some time, my father was here, he learned English. I'll tell you how he learned English. He did a couple of things. Number one, my father signed up for Spanish 101. So when he was a freshman at UT, he signed up for Spanish 101. Now, you might say, okay, why would a native Spanish speaker take Spanish 101? That seems a little dumb. Well, what my father would do is he'd sit in the classroom, and he would basically try to reverse engineer everything. So the professor would say, milk is leche. And he'd write it down and go, oh, leche is milk. And he'd just try to sit and listen, and as the teacher was teaching Spanish, he'd try to do everything backwards and figure out what the English thing was. The other thing my dad did quite a bit is on Saturdays he would go to a movie theater. Both my dad and I love movies. In fact, as a kid, I would go with my parents all the time to movies. It was one of the things we loved to do together, still do. But my dad used to go to a movie on Saturdays. And he'd sit there and watch the same movie in English typically 3 times. He'd just sit there and watch it. And look, when he first came to Austin, he'd watch a movie in English 3 times and have no idea what was going on the first, second, or third time. But then he'd do it again. And then he'd do it again. And the human brain is a miraculous thing. As he'd watch the movie 2 or 3 times, by the second time you start picking up context, you start picking up what's going on, he'd start following the plot. By the 3rd time, he could follow it even more. And so relatively quickly, my father learned English. Now, I will note, Mr. President, he had a pretty exquisite incentive to learn English. His incentive to learn English was, if he didn't, he was going to flunk out of school because he was taking his classes in English. Now, he took mostly math classes, and math was, the sort of thing that you didn't need as much language as you do in other topics. But if he didn't learn English pretty fast, he was going to flunk out of the University of Texas. Once he learned English, he managed at the restaurant he was working at to get a promotion. He got a promotion to be a cook. Now, being a cook was a good, look, being a cook was a lot better than being a dishwasher. Paid a little bit more. I don't know how much he got paid as a cook, but it paid better than 50 cents an hour. Now, he had to speak enough English that when someone, came in and ordered, let me get a steak and potatoes, he had to know what a steak and potatoes was and not give them scrambled eggs. So he'd learned enough English that he could be a cook and respond to the orders. And actually, when my dad was a cook, the place he worked was a place called the Toddle House, and it was a place where the cooks were in front of the people. It was sort of, it doesn't exist anymore, but my father sort of described it as like a Denny's, imagine a Denny's combined with a Benihana's, where the menu was sort of like a Denny's, but the cook was in front of you and you could see him. So my dad learned to, like, for example, flip pancakes, which I got to tell you, as a kid, on a Saturday or Sunday morning when your dad's making pancakes, it is very cool when he can, like, flip them and make them do a flip high in the air and catch them. But he had to do that. He also, I will credit my father, he invented, this wasn't for the restaurant, but he did it anyway, he invented green eggs and ham. He did it two ways. One, the easy way is he'd put green food coloring in eggs, chop up ham in it, and as a kid, Green Eggs and Ham was my favorite book when I was a little boy. And so he would make me green eggs and ham. You can actually do it. The food coloring is a little bit cheating, but if you actually take something like spinach and mix it into the eggs turn green. So my dad worked as a cook to finish his way through the University of Texas. 1961, my dad graduated, got a math degree. And his next job was he got hired as a teaching assistant. He began taking graduate classes at the University of Texas in mathematics. And he got hired as a teaching assistant teaching undergrads math. Now, a teaching assistant was a better job than washing dishes or being a cook. It paid more, and it had more forward advancement. So he enjoyed being a teaching assistant. He had all sorts of clever final exam questions that he would give. He taught college algebra. Remember, one of his final exam questions was, you have a triangle with sides 11, 20, and 9. Compute the area. And he'd get students that would write pages and pages of trying to put all these various equations, trying to figure out the area. Almost all of them were wrong. It's a basic rule of geometry that for a triangle, any two sides, the sum of any two sides has to be longer than the third side, or else they don't actually meet. A triangle of sides 11, 20, and 9, 9 and 11 add up to 20. That is a straight line. The area is 0. So he enjoyed kind of coming up with clever final exam questions. That was one of them. But from there, after being a teaching assistant, he applied for and he got a job with IBM as a computer programmer. This was, I think, 1962, 1963. It was in the early 60s. And from there, he got the skills as a computer programmer. He worked in the oil and gas industry, and he went on with my mother subsequently to start a small business, a seismic data processing company in the oil and gas business. So when I was a kid, I grew up, my parents were small business owners. You know, when I talk about small businesses, like a great many Americans, the majority of Americans, it's not a hypothetical. I've grown up as the son of two small business owners, of seeing the hard work, the challenges of trying to run a small business. And in fact, I saw my parents' business go bankrupt. When I was in high school, I saw the upsides and the downsides of being in a small business. It ain't easy. But you know, Mr. President, if my father had not been able to get that first job, washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour, he never would have gotten a second job. He never would have gotten his second job as a cook. If he hadn't gotten his second job, he wouldn't have gotten his third job as a teaching assistant. If he hadn't gotten that job, he wouldn't have been hired by IBM. And if he hadn't been hired by IBM, he wouldn't have been able to start a small business. You know, earlier this afternoon, the senator from Utah talked about opportunity, talked about the American dream. When you look at a statistic like the fact that African-American teenage unemployment is 38.2%, you're talking about a generation of young people that aren't getting that first job. They aren't getting the equivalent today of that job washing dishes, making 15 cents an hour. They're not getting hired flipping burgers in the fast food restaurant because the impact of Obamacare on the fast food business is so devastating that it is hammering those workers. And, you know, the travesty of that is not that they don't get to flip burgers. Flipping burgers is not necessary. It's honorable work, but it's not necessarily the fulfillment of someone's life ambitions. But it is so frequently a stepping stone to the next job and the next job and the next job. And if you're a young kid, look, one of the things you have to learn are basic work skills. How to show up on time. You know, a lot of teenagers are not very good at showing up on time. They don't understand how to show up on time. Even some U.S. senators haven't figured that out. And yet, if a young American doesn't get a job where they learn to work with coworkers, they learn to work with customers, they learn to work with their boss, they learn to show up on time, they learn to watch their language and not use profanity, they learn to be courteous, to be respectful, to be diligent, to be responsible. Those are the skills it takes to achieve in any job. You know, some time ago I tweeted a speech that Ashton Kutcher gave. It's actually a terrific speech. It was a speech at one of these award shows where he talked about the value of hard work. And one of the things I remember he said is, he said, you know, in my life, opportunity looks an awful lot like hard work. That was a great message. It was a great message to young people. Part of the reason I tweeted it out and to salute him, and I don't know Mr. Kutcher, I've watched his TV shows and his movies. I don't know him personally. But you know what? He can speak to millions of young people who'd never listen to you and would never listen to me. And so I salute him for carrying a message to young people about hard work and diligence and working towards the American dream. And the greatest travesty of what's happening with Obamacare is a generation of young people being denied a fair chance at the American dream. If you look at economic growth, according to the Bureau of Economic Affairs, GDP growth over the last 4 quarters has been